I stood in my study, staring at the second drawer of my filing cabinet. It was open by just a fraction of an inch. I knew that latch. I had pressed it shut every single night for 12 years. Someone had been digging through my life. Someone had been counting my money as if it were already theirs. My own son. I did not scream. I did not confront him. Instead, I quietly moved every single dollar of my 41K into a private trust he could not touch. While my son and his wife were at their morning yoga class, I had a locksmith change every single bolt in the house. 2 hours later, their key turned in the lock, but the door did not budge. I was already 60 miles down the highway, heading toward the mountains with my suitcases and my dignity. Before I tell you how I rebuilt my life in a new city at 68, I would love to know which state you are watching from today. Please note, while this story is shared for entertainment, the message about protecting your independence and your boundaries is very much real. My name is Evelyn, and this is how I reclaimed my life. My son, Caleb, called it a simple conversation. He arrived at my house on a Tuesday afternoon in October, carrying a coffee cake in a white bakery box. That was how I knew it was not just a conversation. In my house, a bakery box on a weekday usually meant there was bad news to be softened or a difficult request to be made. We sat across from each other at my kitchen table. The autumn sun was hitting the oak trees in the yard, and the coffee cake sat between us, untouched and still in its cardboard box. Caleb leaned forward and looked at me with a very specific kind of kindness. It was the kind of kindness people use when they have decided you are no longer capable of taking care of yourself. He said, "Mom, we think it is time someone helped you manage your finances." The word, we, that word landed much harder than any other part of his sentence. He did not say I. He did not say he. He said we. This meant that a discussion had already happened. It meant decisions had been made in a room where I was not invited. It meant Caleb and his wife, Megan, had been talking about my life behind my back. I set down my mug very slowly. I wanted my hands to be steady. I asked him who exactly he had in mind for this task. He smiled then. It was a rehearsed smile. He told me that he and Megan had been talking, and with everything I had been carrying alone since my husband passed away, it just made sense to have a second set of eyes on things. A second set of eyes. He was talking about the retirement account I had built over 31 years as a registered nurse. He was talking about the pension I had earned by working the night shifts while he was sleeping soundly in his bed down the hall. He was talking about my 41K. I told him that I had been managing just fine. I said it clearly. I said it firmly. But he brushed it off too quickly. He agreed with me in that way people do when they have already decided to override your opinion. He mentioned that Megan noticed I had made another donation last month to a literacy nonprofit and another one to the local animal shelter. I looked at him carefully. I asked him how Megan knew what I had donated. He shifted in his seat. He looked a little uncomfortable. He said she saw the mail. He said she saw the mail in my house while she was staying here for 3 weeks. They had been staying with me because their kitchen was being renovated. It was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to be family helping family. I had given them a key because I trusted them. Caleb said they just wanted to make sure no one took advantage of me. He said there were many scams targeting people of my age. People of my age. I was 68 years old. I had managed a cardiac unit for 11 years. I had calculated life-saving medication dosages under extreme pressure. I had trained staff who were half my age. I realized then that the coffee cake was just a prop. It was the part of the plan where I was supposed to feel grateful for their interference. I looked at my son, my only child, and I felt a chill in the room. He had come here with a plan, and he truly believed I would just say yes. I realized that when someone presents control as if it were care, the most dangerous thing you can do is argue, because if you argue, you become difficult. And when you are a woman of a certain age, being difficult can quickly become a medical diagnosis. So, I did not argue. I simply told him I would think about it. I watched him relax, thinking he had won. But as he reached for a slice of that cake, I was already wondering if Megan had already been through the filing cabinet in my study. I was already starting to count the cost of my silence. The kitchen was quiet, but it was not the peaceful kind of quiet I usually enjoyed. It was the kind of heavy, thick silence that follows a statement you cannot take back. Caleb sat there, looking at me with that practiced expression of concern. He had just mentioned my donations, my private, personal donations, to causes that meant something to my heart. He told me that Megan had noticed. Megan, my daughter-in-law. She had been staying in my guest room for 3 weeks. She was here because their beautiful home was having a kitchen renovation. I had welcomed them. I had cleared out my spare closet. I had made sure there was fresh coffee every morning. I thought I was being a good mother. I thought I was being a supportive grandmother. But as Caleb spoke, the truth settled in my stomach like lead. Megan had not just been a guest. She had been an observer. He said, "Mom, Megan noticed you made another donation last month to that literacy nonprofit. And the month before that, you sent a check to the animal shelter." I looked at my son. I felt a strange prickle of heat behind my neck. I asked him, very calmly, how Megan knew about my private charitable giving. He shifted his weight. He looked down at his coffee. He said that she saw the mail. She saw the mail in my house. In this country, the mailbox is supposed to be sacred. It is a federal offense to tamper with someone else's mail. But to Caleb and Megan, my mailbox was apparently just another data point. They saw the envelopes from the charities. They saw the thank you notes. They saw the tax receipts. Caleb leaned in closer. He used a voice that was soft, almost like he was talking to a child. He said, "We just want to make sure no one is taking advantage of you, Mom. There are so many scams out there. People are targeting seniors. They see a widow living alone, and they think they have found a gold mine. Targeting seniors. Taking advantage." These were the buzzwords he used to justify their invasion. He was using my age as a weapon against my autonomy. I was 68 years old. I had spent 31 years as a registered nurse. I had seen everything. I had dealt with grieving families, difficult doctors, and complicated medical emergencies. I had managed a cardiac unit with a multi-million-dollar budget for over a decade. I had calculated dosages where a single decimal point could mean the difference between life and death. And yet, here was my son, telling me that I could not be trusted to write a check to an animal shelter. He made it sound like my generosity was a symptom of a declining mind. He made it sound like my heart was a liability. I thought about those donations. I gave to the literacy fund because I remember the look on a patient's face when they could not read their own discharge papers. I gave to the animal shelter because after my husband passed away 14 months ago, the quiet in this house was deafening, and the thought of a lonely dog in a cage broke my heart. Those choices were mine. I had earned the money. I had worked the double shifts. I had dealt with the stress and the fatigue of a long career. Caleb continued to talk about protection. He talked about how they just wanted to be involved. He said it was just practical. Just family. That word, family, was being used to blur the lines of my privacy. He was trying to make me feel like I was being selfish for wanting to keep my finances to myself. I realized then that they weren't just worried about scams. They were worried about their future inheritance. They were looking at my bank account and counting the dollars, as if they already belonged to them. Every dollar I gave to a charity was a dollar that would not go to their new kitchen or their next car. I didn't argue. My nursing training taught me that when a patient is agitated or irrational, you don't raise your voice. You remain steady. You remain observant. I told him I understood his concern. I told him I appreciated that they cared so much. I lead. I watched him relax. He thought he had successfully planted the seed. He thought I was the same mother who used to let him win at checkers. He did not realize that I was still the woman who had run a hospital unit with an iron will. As he got up to leave, he mentioned that Megan would be by later to pick up some of her things. He told me they loved me. He told me they just wanted me to be safe. I stood at the door and watched his car pull out of the driveway. The neighborhood was beautiful. The oak trees were turning gold and red. It looked like a perfect American dream. But inside my house, the air felt thin. I realized that my home was no longer my sanctuary. It had become a place where I was being watched. And I knew, with a sudden and sharp clarity, that I had to act. After Caleb left, the house felt far too large. I walked through the hallway, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. I went into my study. This was my space. It was filled with my books, my nursing journals, and the desk where my husband and I used to sit and plan our summer vacations. I walked over to the heavy oak filing cabinet in the corner. It was an old-fashioned piece of furniture, solid and dependable. I have a very specific habit. For 12 years, I have closed the second drawer of that cabinet in a very specific way. The latch is a bit sticky. You have to push it firmly until you hear a sharp, metallic click. If you don't hear that click, the drawer is not fully closed. I looked at the drawer. It was resting just a quarter of an inch away from the frame. There was no click. My heart began to beat a little faster. I knew I had closed that drawer 3 days ago after I filed my property tax receipt. I knew I had heard the click. I am a woman of routine. You do not survive 30 years in a high-pressure hospital environment without being a person of routine. I reached out and pulled the drawer open. It glided too easily, as if it had been opened and closed many times recently. I looked at the hanging folders. Retirement, savings, insurance, house deed. I pulled out the folder labeled Retirement Accounts. This was where I kept my 41K statements and my pension documents. I opened it. At first glance, everything looked normal. But I am a nurse. I am trained to notice the smallest deviations in a patient's chart. I keep my bank statements in reverse chronological order. The most recent statement should always be on top. I looked at the dates. The statement from March was on top, but when I flipped the page, the statement underneath it was from January. The February statement was tucked behind the one from October. Someone had been reading my files, and someone had been in a hurry when they put them back. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. It was Megan. It had to be. While she was staying here, while I was out at my water aerobics class or at the grocery store, she had been in here. She had sat in my chair. She had opened my private files. She had looked at the numbers I had worked my entire life to accumulate. She wasn't just looking at the mail. She was doing a deep dive into my net worth. She was calculating the scale of my assets. She and Caleb had sat in their home and discussed my money based on the information she had stolen from this drawer. I felt a sense of betrayal that is hard to put into words. I had opened my home to them. I had given them my trust. And they had repaid me by treating me like a case study. They were looking for a reason to take control. They were looking for a weakness. I sat down in my desk chair and stared at the misarranged papers. I thought about the conversation in the kitchen. Caleb's words about protection and scams now felt even more calculated. They weren't trying to protect me from the world. They were trying to protect my money from me. They saw a woman who was 68. They saw a widow. In their eyes, I was no longer the Wai Ta Trung who could manage a crisis. I was just a pile of assets that needed to be secured. I didn't cry. I felt a cold, hard anger beginning to form. It was a useful anger. It was the kind of anger that makes you sharp. I realized that if I confronted them now, they would deny it. Or worse, they would use my anger as proof that I was becoming unstable or irritable. They would say I was being paranoid. They would use my own reaction to build their case for guardianship. I knew how the system worked. I had seen families do this to patients in the hospital. It always started with concern. Then it moved to oversight. And finally, it ended with the person losing their right to decide where they lived or how they spent their own hard-earned money. I realized I could not stay in this house. Not long term. Not if my own son was willing to let his wife spy on me. I picked up the February statement and put it back where it belonged. I aligned the edges of the papers perfectly. I closed the drawer and pushed it until I heard that familiar, solid click. I walked to the window and looked at the oak tree in the yard. My husband had planted that tree 30 years ago. It was strong and deeply rooted. But even the strongest tree can be cut down if you aren't careful. I picked up my phone. I didn't call Caleb. I didn't call Megan. I called Martha in Tucson. Martha had been my best friend since we were in nursing school together in 1974. She was the only person who would listen without giving me a pitying look. When she answered, I told her everything. I told her about the coffee cake. I told her about the mail. And I told her about the drawer. Martha was silent for a long time. Then, she said something I will never forget. She said, Evelyn, they aren't waiting for you to lose your mind. They are trying to take it from you while you are still using it. I knew she was right. I told her I had a plan. I told her I was going to be the most agreeable, pleasant mother they had ever seen. I was going to play the part they expected of me. And while I played that part, I was going to move every single dollar out of their reach. I stayed up late that night, making a list. I didn't use my computer. I used a plain notebook and a pen. I wrote down the names of banks. I wrote down the name of the attorney, Sarah Jenkins. I wrote down the steps I needed to take. As I sat there in the quiet of the night, I realized that my life was changing. The second chapter of my life was starting. And it was not the one I had imagined. But I was a nurse. I knew how to follow a care plan. And this time, the patient I was saving was myself. After I discovered the misarranged files in my study, the air in my home felt different. It felt heavy. I realized that my house was no longer a place of total privacy. Every time I heard the floorboards creak, I wondered if Megan was standing in the hallway, listening. Every time the phone rang, I wondered if Caleb was calling to check if I sounded confused. I sat in my dark kitchen that night, staring at the moonlight hitting the oak tree outside. I knew one thing for certain. I could not confront them. In 31 years as a nurse, I have seen exactly what happens when an older person gets angry with their children. If I raised my voice, if I called Megan a spy, if I told Caleb to stay out of my business, they would not apologize. No, they would use my anger as a weapon. They would call it agitation. They would call it irritability. They would say, I was having a hard time coping with my husband's death. They would go to a doctor and say that Mom is not herself lately. She is acting out. She is becoming difficult to manage. And in this country, once you are labeled as difficult, you are halfway to losing your rights. So, I made a decision. I would be the most agreeable mother they had ever seen. I would smile. I would listen. I would play the part of the lonely widow who was grateful for their attention. I picked up the phone and called my friend Martha in Tucson. Martha had been my rock since 1974. She was the only person who understood that being 68 did not mean I was finished. When I told her about my plan to be agreeable, she laughed. It was a sharp, knowing laugh. She told me, Evelyn, that it is the smartest thing you have ever done. If you fight them, they will find a way to lock you down. If you agree with them, they will get sloppy. We talked for over an hour. We talked about how our generation of women had worked so hard to build our own lives. We had gone to work when people told us to stay home. We had managed households and careers. We had earned our independence. And we were not about to give it away because our children wanted a larger inheritance. The next morning, Caleb called. I could hear the hesitation in his voice. He was waiting for me to be angry about our conversation the day before. He was waiting for the argument he had prepared. I didn't give it to him. When he asked how I was doing, I told him I felt wonderful. I told him I had been thinking about what he said. I told him, Caleb, I think you and Megan are so sweet to worry about me. I really do appreciate having such a caring family. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear his brain resetting. He had spent the night preparing for a battle, and I had just handed him a white flag. He asked me if I was serious. I told him, of course. I told him that maybe having a second set of eyes on my accounts wasn't such a bad idea after all. I said it with a light, airy tone. I sounded like a woman who was tired of thinking for herself. He sounded so relieved. He told me he was so happy I was being reasonable. Reasonable. That was the word he used. To him, being reasonable meant doing exactly what he wanted. I spent the rest of the week being perfectly pleasant. When Megan came over to drop off some groceries, I didn't mention the filing cabinet. I didn't mention the mail. I made her a cup of herbal tea, and asked her about the new tile she was picking out for her kitchen. I listened to her talk for 40 minutes about marble versus quartz. Inside, I was screaming. But on the outside, I was a grandmother who just loved her family. I watched her. I watched the way she looked around my living room. She was already mentally redecorating it. She was looking at my antique clock and my husband's favorite chair as if they were items in an estate sale. I realized then that my silence was my greatest power. Because they thought I had surrendered, they stopped being careful. They talked openly about their plans. They mentioned a house in Austin they had been looking at. They talked about how much easier my life would be if I moved closer to them. They thought they were winning. But while I was nodding and smiling, I was counting the days. I was making appointments. I was building a wall around my life that they would never be able to climb. I learned something important that week. People only see what they expect to see. They expected to see a fading woman who needed help. So, that is what I gave them. It was a performance. It was the most important role I had ever played, and it gave me the time I needed to save myself. On Wednesday morning, while Caleb was at work and Megan was at her yoga class, I drove to a part of town I rarely visited. I pulled my car into a small, professional parking lot. The sign on the door was simple. Sarah Jenkins, attorney at law. I had found Sarah through a recommendation from a former nursing colleague. She was known for being sharp, discreet, and deeply protective of her clients. I walked into her office. It smelled of expensive paper and old books. It felt like a place where things were handled with precision. Sarah was a woman in her early 50s. She had graying hair cut into a sharp bob and eyes that didn't miss a thing. She didn't treat me like a grandmother. She treated me like a client. I told her everything. I told her about the 41K. I told her about the pension. I told her about the filing cabinet and the coffee cake. I told her about the pressure my son was putting on me to give up control. Sarah listened without interrupting. She took notes with a fountain pen. When I finished, she sat back and looked at me. She said, "Evelyn, you are not the first person to walk through that door with this story. It is a very common American tragedy. Children see their parents as a retirement plan, and they use guilt as a way to access the funds." She told me that what Caleb was doing was the beginning of a push for guardianship. She explained that if I wasn't careful, they could try to have me declared incompetent. They could take over my house, my bank accounts, and my medical decisions. I felt a cold chill, but Sarah leaned forward, and her voice became very firm. She said, "But they can only do that if you are unprotected. Today, we are going to build you a fortress." We spent the next 3 hours working. Sarah explained the concept of a revocable living trust. She told me that by moving my assets into this trust, I would still have total control over my money. However, the trust would be a separate legal entity. I would be the sole trustee. I moved my house, my savings, and my entire retirement fund into the trust. I made it very clear in the documents that I was the only person with the authority to change anything. Then, we addressed the issue of the power of attorney. This is the document that allows someone to make decisions for you if you become incapacitated. Caleb expected to be that person. He thought it was his birthright. I told Sarah, "I want to name Martha as my power of attorney." Sarah nodded. She said that was a wise choice. Naming a friend who is your own age, or a professional, is often better than naming a child who has a financial interest in your estate. Martha had already agreed. She was steady. She was honest, and she didn't want my money. We also drafted a very specific letter to my bank and my investment firm. The letter stated that I was working with legal counsel and that any third-party inquiries regarding my accounts, even from my own family, were to be reported to my attorney and me immediately. As I signed the papers, I felt a massive weight lifting off my shoulders. For months, I had felt like I was drowning in a sea of we. We think you should do this. We think you need help. Now, there was only I. I decided. I protected. I owned. Sarah handed me a folder with all the signed documents. She told me that these papers were now my shield. She said, "If your son tries to bring in a financial advisor or tries to force you to sign anything, you tell them to call me. The moment an attorney is involved, People like your son usually back off. They don't want a legal fight. They want an easy win. I paid her fee. It was several $1,000s, and it was the best money I had ever spent. I was not just buying legal documents, I was buying my freedom. I was buying the right to live the rest of my life on my own terms. When I walked out of her office, the sun was bright. I felt light on my feet. I went to a small cafe nearby and ordered a sandwich and a glass of iced tea. I sat there by myself, a 68-year-old woman with a folder full of power. I looked at the people walking by. No one knew that I had just secured my future. No one knew that I had just outmaneuvered my own son. I thought about Caleb. I still loved him. He was the boy I had raised. He was the child I had stayed up with during every fever and every heartbreak. But I realized that loving someone does not mean you have to let them destroy you. I drove home with the folder tucked under the passenger seat. When I walked into my house, I saw Megan's yoga mat leaning against the wall in the hallway. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel afraid. I went into my study, opened the filing cabinet, and put the new trust documents in a brand new folder. I pushed the drawer shut until I heard that beautiful, solid click. That night, when Caleb called to ask if I wanted to go to dinner on Friday, I said yes. I told him I would love to. I sounded happy. I sounded carefree. I knew that he was still thinking about his plan. He was still thinking about Greg, the financial advisor he wanted me to meet. He had no idea that the game was already over. He had no idea that his mother was no longer a victim. I was a trustee. I was a client. And most importantly, I was an independent woman. The fortress was built. Now, all I had to do was decide when to walk out of it. The following Saturday morning was exactly as I had predicted. Caleb had sent me a text message the night before. He said, "Mom, a friend of mine named Brandon is going to swing by tomorrow around 11. He is a financial expert. He is very low-key. No pressure. Just a simple conversation to help you feel more secure. No pressure." I had spent 31 years as a nurse, and I had learned that whenever someone says there is no pressure, they are usually about to lean on you with everything they have. I texted back a very short answer. I said, "Saturday works." I spent the morning preparing. I did not hide. I did not act nervous. I made a fresh pot of coffee. I put out a plate of lemon shortbread cookies. I wanted the house to look perfectly normal. I wanted to look like the cooperative mother they thought I was. Brandon arrived exactly 12 minutes early. In the business world, that is a tactic. It is meant to catch you off guard. It is meant to show that he is eager and professional. He was a young man, probably in his late 30s. He wore a crisp blue shirt with no tie and expensive-looking loafers. He had that specific kind of confidence that some men have when they believe they are the smartest person in the room, especially when the other person is a 68-year-old woman. Caleb arrived a few minutes later. He looked pleased with himself. He sat on the sofa and told me how lucky we were that Brandon could find time for us on the weekend. Brandon opened a sleek leather folder and started talking. He talked for 20 minutes. He used a lot of big words. He talked about portfolio diversification. He talked about long-term care insurance. He talked about the particular vulnerabilities of widowed seniors who are managing assets alone. Vulnerabilities. He used that word 4 times. I was counting. Every time he said it, I felt a little spark of fire in my chest. He was talking to me as if I were a patient with a failing heart. He was looking at me with pity. He truly believed that I was overwhelmed by the numbers in my bank account. He didn't know that I had spent years managing the complex budgets of an entire hospital department. He didn't know that I had negotiated contracts with vendors that would make his head spin. To him, I was just a widow with a nest egg that needed to be protected. Protected by him. For a fee, of course. Then came the moment I was waiting for. Brandon slid a piece of paper across the coffee table. It was a preliminary engagement letter. He said, "This just gives me the authority to start looking at your accounts, so I can give you a better recommendation. It is just a standard form." I looked at the paper. I did not touch it. I looked at Brandon and asked him a very simple question. I asked, "What exactly would your role be here?" He smiled. It was a very smooth smile. He said his role would be advisory, oversight, helping to make sure my assets were positioned correctly. I repeated that word. Positioned? I asked. Positioned correctly according to whom? He hesitated for just a second. He said, according to sound financial principles. I leaned back in my chair. I looked at my son, Caleb. He was watching me closely. I could see the hope in his eyes. He thought this was it. He thought I was about to sign over my life to his friend. I said, I would like to understand something. I want to know if this meeting was initiated by me or by my son. There was a very brief pause in the room. Brandon cleared his throat. He said that my son had expressed some concern and made the introduction, but he insisted that this was entirely my decision. Caleb spoke up then. He said, "Mom, we just want you to be safe. We want to know that everything is in order." I turned back to Brandon. I told him, "Thank you for coming." I told him I appreciated the information. Then, I said the words that changed everything. I said, "I will take this letter and review it with my own attorney before I sign anything." The temperature in the room changed instantly. It was as if I had dumped a bucket of ice water on the table. Brandon's smile did not disappear, but it became very stiff. He said, "Oh, I didn't realize you were working with an attorney." I said, "I have been working with a very talented woman named Sarah Jenkins. She handles my estate and my trust. I am sure she will want to look this over, to make sure it aligns with my current legal structure." The word attorney is a powerful thing. It means you are not alone. It means there is a paper trail. It means that the next conversation will not be a friendly chat over coffee cake. It will be a legal discussion. Brandon started closing his leather folder. He said he understood completely. He said he didn't want to step on any toes. Caleb was staring at me. He looked shocked. He looked like he had just realized that the mother he was trying to manage was much more dangerous than he thought. Brandon left about 10 minutes later. He made some excuses about another appointment. He didn't even finish his coffee. After he was gone, Caleb stood in the hallway. He asked me why I hadn't told him I had a lawyer. I looked at him and said, "Caleb, I don't mention every appointment I make, just like I don't expect you to tell me everything you do with your life. I am an adult. I have my own professionals." He didn't know what to say. He looked at his shoes. He looked frustrated. He looked like a man who had just realized his plan A had failed completely. I felt a strange sense of peace. I realized that by bringing a lawyer into the conversation, I had taken the power back. I was no longer a vulnerable senior. I was a client with representation. I walked Caleb to the door. I gave him a hug. I told him I loved him. And I meant it. But as I watched him walk down the driveway, I knew that our relationship had changed forever. He had tried to trap me, and I had simply walked through the door he forgot to lock. I went back to the kitchen and poured the rest of the coffee down the sink. I washed the lemon shortbread plates. I felt strong. I felt ready for the next step. I called Sarah Jenkins and told her what happened. She laughed. It was a short, sharp laugh. She told me I had done exactly the right thing. She said, "Evelyn, you just showed them that you are the one in charge. Now, we just have to make sure they can't get back in." I knew she was right. The battle for my finances was won, but the battle for my home was just beginning. On Wednesday morning, the sun was just starting to peek through the oak trees. It was a beautiful, crisp morning in North Carolina. I watched from the window as Caleb's car pulled out of his driveway down the street. I knew Megan was at her yoga class. I knew I had at least 2 hours of absolute privacy. I had been planning this for a week. I picked up the phone and called a local locksmith. I told him it was an emergency. I told him I needed all the exterior locks on my house changed immediately. He arrived 20 minutes later in a white van. He was an older man, very professional and very efficient. He didn't ask questions. He just got to work. I stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of the metal hitting the floor as he removed the old, tired locks. Those locks had been on this house for 30 years. They were the locks my husband and I had used when we first moved in. They represented a lifetime of memories. But those locks also represented a vulnerability. I had given a key to Caleb. I had given a key to Megan. I had given them the power to enter my home whenever they pleased. I had given them that power because I thought we were a team. I thought we were a family that respected each other. I was wrong. The locksmith moved from the front door to the back door and then to the side door by the garage. He worked quickly. I watched him and felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. It felt like I was sealing a tomb, but it also felt like I was building a sanctuary. When he was finished, he handed me a set of 3 shiny silver keys. He said, "These are high-security locks, ma'am. No one is getting in without one of these." I thanked him and paid him in cash. I wanted no record of this on my credit card statement until I was ready. I stood at the front door and tested the new key. The sound was beautiful. It was a solid, clean, metallic click. It was the sound of a door that was truly closed. I did it 3 times. Click, click, click. I felt a sense of ownership that I hadn't felt in months. This was my house. My name was on the deed. I had paid the mortgage for 30 years. I had scrubbed the floors and painted the walls. And from this moment on, no one would enter this space unless I invited them. I spent the rest of the morning in a state of quiet productivity. I didn't pack anything yet. I didn't want to leave any clues. I just sat in my living room and enjoyed the silence. It was a silence that I owned. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text message from Megan. She wrote, "Hey, Evelyn. I just stopped by to pick up my yoga mat and some of the mail that Caleb said might have arrived for us. But my key isn't working. It feels stuck. Is there something wrong with the lock?" I sat there for a moment, looking at the screen. My heart was racing, but my hands were steady. This was the moment of truth. This was the first time I was setting a physical boundary. I typed back a very calm and direct message. I wrote, "Hi, Megan. I had the locks changed this morning. The old ones were over 30 years old, and I felt it was time for an update for security reasons. I will be holding on to the spare keys from now on. If you need to stop by, just let me know when you are coming, and I will make sure I am home to let you in." I hit send. The silence that followed was deafening. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Then 5. I could imagine her standing on my front porch, staring at the phone in disbelief. I could imagine the frustration and the confusion on her face. She had been used to walking into my house as if she owned it. She had been used to going through my drawers and looking at my mail. She had been used to treating me like a landlord who didn't have any rights. Finally, she replied. It was a very short text. She wrote, "Oh, okay. No worries." But I knew there were worries. I knew that she was already calling Caleb. I knew that they were already discussing this new development. They would see this as a sign of my erratic behavior. They would say that I was becoming paranoid. But I didn't care. For the first time in months, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. That evening, Caleb called. His voice had a different quality. He wasn't trying to be the concerned son anymore. He sounded annoyed. He sounded like a man who was losing his grip on a situation. He asked me, "Mom, why on earth did you change the locks without telling us?" I said, "Caleb, it is my house. I wanted updated security. I didn't realize I needed to give a report on every maintenance task I perform." He said, "But we have keys for emergencies. What if something happens to you?" I told him, "I am fine, Caleb. If there is a real emergency, the fire department has tools for that. But for daily life, I prefer to know who is coming and going from my home." There was a long pause. He asked me, "Are you feeling okay, Mom?" There it was. The question. The attempt to make me feel like I was losing my mind. I said, "I have never felt better. I have never felt more clear. We hung up shortly after that. I went to my study and opened my notebook. I wrote down the date and the time. I wrote down the exact words he used. I noted that he had used the "Are you feeling okay?" framing for the first time. I realized that every time I stood up for myself, they would try to pathologize my strength. They would call my independence confusion. They would call my boundaries paranoia. I looked at the new silver key on the table. It was small, but it was heavy with meaning. It was the key to my new life. I knew that the next few weeks would be difficult. I knew they would push back. But as I went to bed that night, I didn't feel afraid. I felt like I was finally home. And this time, I was the only one with the key. The phone call from Caleb came at 7 o'clock in the evening. I was sitting in my favorite armchair, the one with the faded floral pattern that my husband always complained about but secretly loved. I was watching the sun set behind the trees. The house felt secure. The new silver keys were sitting on the side table, reflecting the lamplight. I had already felt a sense of peace, but I knew that peace would be challenged. When the phone rang, I did not rush to answer it. I let it ring 3 times. I wanted to be centered. I wanted to be calm. When I finally picked up, Caleb's voice was not the voice of the loving son who had brought me coffee cake. It was a voice filled with a very specific kind of tension. It was the voice of a man who was used to being in control and had suddenly found himself locked out. He didn't start with a greeting. He went straight to the point. He asked me, "Mom, what is going on with the house? Megan told me her key didn't work. She said you changed the locks." I kept my voice steady. I told him, "Yes, I did." I explained that the old locks were over 30 years old. I told him I felt it was time for an update. I said it was a simple matter of home maintenance and security. There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear him breathing. Then, his tone shifted. It became soft. It became patronizing. He said, "Mom, you didn't mention this to anyone. You just went out and did it. It seems a little sudden, don't you think?" I told him that I didn't realize I needed to consult a committee to change the locks on my own front door. I said it with a light laugh, trying to keep the mood from becoming too heavy. But Caleb did not laugh back. He said the words that I had been expecting. He asked me, "Mom, are you feeling okay?" I want you to think about that question for a moment. In American culture, when a child asks an aging parent if they are feeling okay, it is rarely a medical inquiry. It is often the first step in a process called gaslighting. It is a way of suggesting that your decisions are not based on logic, but on a declining mind. It is a way of making you doubt your own reality. I felt a surge of indignation, but I did not let it show in my voice. I knew that if I got angry, it would only give him the evidence he was looking for. If I yelled, he would tell Megan that Mom is becoming irritable and paranoid. "So," I replied very calmly. I told him that I felt wonderful. I told him I had never felt more clear-headed. He didn't stop there. He said, "It just seems like you are acting a bit strange lately. First, you get defensive about your finances. Then you refuse to talk to Brandon, a professional who only wanted to help. And now you are locking your own family out of the house. We are worried, Mom. We are worried that you are becoming isolated." Isolated. That was another buzzword. He was trying to frame my independence as a symptom of loneliness or mental fatigue. He was trying to make my boundaries look like a cry for help. After we hung up, I sat in the silence of my living room for a long time. I realized that I needed a record. I was a nurse. I knew that if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. In the medical world, the chart is everything. It is the shield against malpractice and the proof of a care plan. I decided that I would chart my own life. I went out to the local drugstore the next morning. I bought a plain blue composition notebook. It was the kind students use in high school. It was simple and honest. I came home, sat at my desk, and opened the first page. I wrote down the date. I wrote down the time of the phone call. October 24th, 7:03 p.m. I wrote down the exact phrases Caleb had used. I wrote down, Are you feeling okay? And we are worried you are becoming isolated. I decided that from that moment on, every interaction with my son and Megan would be recorded. If they ever tried to take me to court, if they ever tried to tell a judge that I was confused or losing my grip, I would have this book. I would have a dated, clear, and logical record of every conversation. I realized that this notebook was more than just a diary. It was my evidence of sanity. It was my way of proving to myself, and to the world, that I was the same woman who had run a hospital unit for over a decade. I thought about all the patients I had seen whose families had done this to them. I remembered a woman named Mrs. Higgins. She was 75 and perfectly sharp, but her daughter had convinced everyone that she was sundowning just so she could sell her mother's condo. I had seen the look of betrayal in Mrs. Higgins' eyes. I promised myself that I would not be another Mrs. Higgins. I spent the rest of the day being very productive. I worked in my garden. I pruned the roses. I cleared the dead leaves from the oak tree. I wanted to stay active. I wanted to stay visible to my neighbors. I wanted there to be witnesses to my competence. Every time Caleb called over the next few days, I was perfectly pleasant. I talked about the weather. I talked about a book I was reading. I made sure to mention specific details about my day. I was showing him that my memory was perfect. I was showing him that I was not isolated. And after every call, I went to my study. I opened the blue notebook. I wrote down the details. I realized that Caleb was playing a game of chess. He was trying to move his pieces into place to trap me. But he didn't realize that I had been playing a much harder game for 30 years. I had survived budget cuts, hospital mergers, and the loss of my husband. I was not going to be checkmated by my own son. The blue notebook became my silent companion. It sat in my purse, a heavy weight that gave me comfort. I knew that the next move was coming. I could feel the tension building, but I was ready. I had my trust, I had my lawyer, and I had my record. I was not disappearing. I was not declining. I was simply preparing for the fight of my life. It was a Thursday evening in early November when the next phase of their plan began. Caleb sent a text message that sounded very different from his previous calls. It was soft. It was sentimental. He wrote, "Mom, Megan and I would love to come over tonight. No business, no Brandon. We just want to sit down, share a bottle of wine, and talk openly. Just family. Just family." I knew exactly what that meant. In the world of family disputes, just family is often a code for, "We want to talk to you without your lawyer present." It means they want to use emotion, guilt, and history to get what they couldn't get through logic or pressure. They wanted to catch me in a moment of vulnerability. I agreed to the meeting. I wanted to see what their final play was, but I did not go in unprotected. Before they arrived, I called Sarah Jenkins. I told her about the Just Family meeting. Sarah told me to be very careful. She said, "Evelyn, they are going to try to get you to agree to something verbally. They might even try to record you on their phones. Do not promise anything. Just listen, and then tell them you will think about it." I also took my blue notebook and placed it on the bookshelf, just slightly hidden but within my reach. I made sure my phone was fully charged. I felt like a soldier preparing for a parley. They arrived at 7 o'clock. Megan was carrying a bottle of expensive Cabernet Sauvignon. She gave me a hug that lasted just a little too long. It was a hug that felt like a test, as if she were checking to see if I felt fragile. We sat in the living room. The fire was going in the fireplace, and the room looked warm and inviting. On the surface, we looked like a perfect American family. We talked about Megan's kitchen renovation for a while. She told me the marble countertops had finally been installed. She showed me pictures on her phone. Then, the tone changed. Caleb leaned forward. He didn't have a folder this time. He just had a look of deep, pained concern. He said, "Mom, we've been having a lot of sleepless nights lately. We love you so much, and we are just so worried about the future." I asked him what specifically was keeping him awake. He said, "It's the thought of something happening to you and us not being able to help. If you had a medical emergency, or if you became suddenly confused, We wouldn't even be able to talk to your bank. We wouldn't know if your bills were being paid. We would be completely in the dark. Megan joined in. Her voice was very soft, almost whispering. She said, "We were hoping for something very simple, Evelyn. We were wondering if you would be willing to add Caleb's name to your primary accounts. Not to spend the money, of course. Just for visibility. Just so we can see what is happening and make sure everything is okay. Visibility. That was the word of the night. I sat there and looked at them. I thought about the thousands of hours I had worked to earn that money. I thought about the filing cabinet and the way Megan had gone through my papers. I thought about the trust I had built with Sarah Jenkins. They were asking me to give them a key to my life's work. In the United States, adding a child's name to a bank account often gives them full legal right to the funds. It makes the money theirs as much as it is yours. It is a dangerous move that many seniors regret when it is too late. I took a sip of my wine. I let the silence hang in the room for a long time. I wanted them to feel the weight of what they were asking. I said, "I appreciate that you want to be prepared for an emergency. It shows that you care. But I want to be very transparent with you both." Caleb looked hopeful. He thought he was about to get exactly what he wanted. I continued. "I have spent the last few weeks working with a very professional estate attorney. I have already set up a comprehensive legal structure to handle exactly the situations you are describing." The look on Caleb's face was something I will never forget. It was a mix of shock and anger. He asked, "What kind of structure?" I told him. "I have moved my primary assets into a revocable living trust. I am the sole trustee. I have also updated my power of attorney and my medical directives. If anything happens to me, there is a clear, legal plan in place. Everything is documented. Everything is protected." The room went cold. The just family warmth evaporated instantly. Caleb's voice became sharp. He said, "You did this without telling us? We are your family, Mom. Why would you go to a lawyer behind our backs?" I looked him right in the eye. I told him, "I didn't go behind your back, Caleb. I made a private decision about my private property. I am 68 years old. I am a retired nurse. I know how to manage a crisis. And I know how to plan for the future. I have done exactly what any responsible adult would do." Megan looked like she was about to cry, but I could see the frustration in her eyes. She said, "We were just trying to help. We thought we were a team." I told her, "We are a family, but a team is built on respect and boundaries. I do not ask to see your bank accounts, Megan, and I do not expect you to see mine." Caleb stood up. He began to pace the room. He said, "This is because of the locks, isn't it? You think we are trying to steal from you?" I told him. "I don't think you are thieves, Caleb. But I do think you have begun to count my money as if it were already yours. And I have decided to make sure that it remains mine until the day I decide otherwise." He didn't have an answer for that. He was trapped by the very logic he had tried to use against me. He had used the excuse of protection, and I had simply provided my own. They left shortly after that. The bottle of wine was only half finished. They didn't hug me at the door this time. They walked out into the cold November night, and I watched their taillights disappear down the street. I went to my study. I opened the blue notebook. I wrote down the date. I wrote down the time. I wrote down the phrase, "just for visibility." I realized that the trap had been set, and I had simply walked around it. But I also knew that this was the end of my life in this house. The tension was now too great. The air was poisoned by suspicion. I picked up the phone and called my sister Grace in Asheville. I told her, "Grace, I think I'm ready to come see those mountains. I realize that protecting your money is one thing, but protecting your peace of mind is another. I had won the battle for my assets. Now, I needed to win the battle for my future." I began to pack that night. I didn't pack everything, just the things that mattered. The photos, the books, the watch my husband gave me, and my jade plant. I was not running away. I was relocating. I was taking my life and moving it to a place where I could breathe. I was 68 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was truly, legally, and emotionally free. The silence that followed my announcement about the trust was not a peaceful one. It was the kind of silence that happens right before a storm breaks. I sat in my living room watching my son Caleb. I could see the gears turning in his head. He had tried the professional approach with Brandon, and that had failed. He had tried the emotional approach of just family, and I had countered that with legal facts. Now he was desperate. And when people are desperate, they reach for the most painful weapon they have. Caleb looked at me, his eyes filling with a very convincing kind of sadness. He said, "Mom, I just don't understand why you are being so defensive. We are only doing what is best for you." Then he took a deep breath and said the words that were meant to break my heart. He said, "Dad would have wanted us to look out for you. He would have wanted us to make sure you were taken care of. I want you to understand the weight of that sentence. In a long marriage, the memory of a spouse is sacred. My husband, Thomas, had been gone for 14 months. Every day, I lived with the shadow of his absence. Caleb knew this. He was using his father's ghost to try and make me feel guilty. He was trying to make me feel like by protecting my independence, I was somehow betraying the man I had loved for over 3 decades. I let that sentence sit in the air. I did not react immediately. I am a nurse. I have sat with hundreds of families in their darkest hours. I know how to recognize when someone is using grief as a lever. I looked at Caleb. I thought about Thomas. I thought about the man who had stood by me when I was working 60-hour weeks at the hospital. I thought about the man who had sat at this very table and told me how much he admired my strength and my mind. I said to Caleb, very quietly, "Let us talk about your father." Caleb looked hopeful. He thought he had found my weak spot. I continued, "Your father spent 34 years watching me handle crises that would have kept most people awake at night. He watched me manage entire hospital departments. He watched me make life and death decisions for patients. He respected me, Caleb. He trusted me completely. And because I know him better than anyone else on this earth, I can tell you this for a fact." I paused, making sure Caleb was looking me in the eye. I said, "Your father would be appalled by this conversation. He would be horrified to see his son trying to treat his mother like a child who cannot manage her own checkbook. He would be ashamed that you were using his memory to try and manipulate me." The room went completely still. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Megan looked down at her wine glass, her face turning a deep shade of red. Caleb's jaw tightened. The mask of concern was finally slipping, and underneath it was something much colder. It was the frustration of a man who realized he was not going to get what he wanted. I realized then the absolute truth behind all their concern. It was never about my health. It was never about scams or my vulnerability as a senior. It was about their own plans. Earlier that evening, Megan had mentioned their renovation again, but she had also let slip a detail about a house in Austin. A house that was much larger and much more expensive than the one they currently owned. They needed a down payment. They were looking at my retirement savings as a bank. They had already spent my 4001k in their minds. I realized that they weren't worried I would lose my money to a scammer. They were worried I would spend it on myself. They were worried I would give it to a charity or move away before they could secure their share. I said to them both, "I love you. I truly do. But I am not confused. I am not declining. I am not a balance sheet for you to manage. I am a woman who has worked hard, loved fiercely, and survived grief. I have earned the right to spend my own money on the causes that move my heart. And I have earned the right to live my life without being monitored like a criminal on probation." Caleb didn't apologize. He didn't say he understood. He just stood up and said, "Fine. If that is how you want to play it, Mom, then you are on your own. Don't call us when you realize you can't handle things by yourself." He walked out the front door without looking back. Megan followed him, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't say they loved me. I stood in my quiet house and listened to their car drive away. I felt a strange mixture of profound sadness and incredible lightness. The truth was out. The pretense of care was gone. The atmosphere of my home had been shattered, but in that shattering, I was finally able to see the way forward. I was 68 years old, and for the first time in my life, I truly knew who I could trust. And the person at the top of that list was myself. The house was very quiet after Caleb and Megan left. It was the kind of quiet that follows a great storm. I walked through the rooms, looking at the life I had built here. The photos on the mantel, the books on the shelves, the furniture that Thomas and I had picked out together. I knew I couldn't stay. The neighborhood was too full of ghosts, and Caleb's house was just a few blocks away. I didn't want to live in a place where I had to look over my shoulder. I didn't want to live in a house where my own son was waiting for me to fail. I had already made the decision. Now, it was just a matter of execution. I am a nurse. I know how to be methodical. I know how to pack a bag for a long shift, and I know how to prepare for an emergency. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I simply went to the attic and brought down 2 large, sturdy suitcases. I spent the next several hours choosing what to take. I didn't want a moving truck. I didn't want to leave a trail that could be followed by anyone who didn't have my best interests at heart. I was not running away. I was relocating. There is a very big difference. I packed my most practical clothes. I packed my medical records and my nursing journals. I packed the small box of jewelry that Thomas had given me over the years. But most importantly, I packed the things that held my soul. I took the photo albums from 1982. I took the watch Thomas was wearing when he died. The one with the small dent on the case from the time he dropped it in the hospital parking lot in 1987. That dent was a memory. That dent was a piece of him. And then I went to the windowsill in the kitchen. I looked at my jade plant. It was thick and green and strong. I had grown it from a tiny cutting given to me by the family of a patient I had cared for 20 years ago. That patient had survived a heart attack against all odds, and his wife had handed me that cutting with tears in her eyes. She told me, like this plant, you help people find their strength to grow again. That jade plant had survived 3 different moves. It had survived the cold winters and the hot North Carolina summers. It was resilient. It was a survivor. Just like me. I carefully wrapped the pot in a thick towel and placed it in a box. I told the plant, "We are going on another adventure." I worked through the night. I didn't feel tired. I felt a surge of energy that I hadn't felt since Thomas passed. It was the energy of purpose. It was the energy of a woman who was taking back her life. At 4:30 in the morning, the world was still dark. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. It was late November, the time of year when the world goes to sleep. But I was waking up. I loaded my suitcases into the trunk of my car. I put the box with the jade plant in the passenger seat. I walked back into the house one last time. I looked at the living room. It was clean and empty of my spirit. I left the African violet on the kitchen table. Megan had always admired that plant. I left it as a gift. I wanted them to know that I wasn't leaving out of malice. I was leaving for clarity. I was leaving because I deserved a life that wasn't a battleground. I locked the front door with my new silver key. I felt the click one last time. Then, I walked to my car, started the engine, and drove away before the sun came up. The highway was nearly empty. I drove toward the west, toward the mountains of Asheville. For the first 2 hours, I didn't even turn on the radio. I just listened to the sound of the tires on the road. I felt the weight of 68 years behind me and the promise of a new chapter ahead. About halfway there, the sun began to rise. The sky turned a brilliant shade of orange and pink, reflecting off the morning frost on the fields. I pulled over to the side of the road and just watched it for a moment. I cried then. I didn't cry because I was afraid. I didn't cry because I regretted my decision. I cried because of the weight of it all. I cried for the house I loved, for the son I had lost to his own greed, and for the man who wasn't there to hold my hand. But as the sun climbed higher, I wiped my eyes and put the car back in gear. I felt a sense of rightness. I realized that you can grieve for what you left behind, while still being excited for where you were going. By the time I reached the outskirts of Asheville, the mountains had appeared on the horizon, the Blue Ridge Mountains. They were old and steady and indifferent to the troubles of the world. They sat there with a complete sense of themselves. I pulled into my sister Grace's driveway. She was already on the porch holding a steaming mug of coffee. She didn't ask me why I was there. She didn't ask me what had happened. She just walked down the steps, took one of my suitcases and said, "Welcome home, Evelyn." I walked into her house. It smelled of cedar and lavender. Grace led me to the guest room. It had a large window that faced the east, toward the mountains. I took the jade plant out of its box and placed it on the windowsill. I watched the morning light hit the green leaves. The plant looked like it belonged there. I realized then that I wasn't just 68 years old. I was a woman who was starting over. I had my money, I had my dignity, and I had my freedom. I was in a place where no one was counting my assets. No one was waiting for me to fail. I sat on the bed and looked at the mountains. I realized that the hardest thing I had ever done was also the best thing I had ever done. I had moved every dollar, and in doing so, I had saved my soul. I was finally home. And this time, I was going to live every day on my own terms. Life in Asheville, North Carolina, began with a deep, cleansing breath. For the first few days at my sister Grace's house, I did something I had not done in a very long time. I slept. I slept through the night without waking up to wonder if a drawer was being opened. I slept without the weight of my son's concern pressing down on my chest. I woke up to the smell of fresh coffee and the sight of the Blue Ridge Mountains through the guest room window. Grace was the perfect companion for this transition. We are sisters, but more than that, we are old friends who have seen each other through the best and worst of times. She understood that I did not need a party or a grand welcome. I needed a rhythm. I needed a space where I was simply Evelyn, not a widow, and not a situation to be managed. We fell into a routine that felt like a warm blanket. In the mornings, we would sit on her back porch, wrapped in sweaters, watching the mist lift off the valleys. We talked about things that didn't matter, and we talked about things that mattered deeply. We talked about Thomas, and we talked about our parents, and we talked about the strange way children grow up and forget that their parents are people too. But I have never been a woman who could sit still for very long. My 31 years as a nurse were not just a job. They were a part of my identity. I missed the feeling of being useful. I missed the quiet authority of knowing how to help someone who was hurting. About 3 weeks after I arrived, I found a volunteer position at a small community clinic just 10 minutes away. It was a place that served people who often fell through the cracks of the healthcare system. They didn't need a high-level administrator. They needed someone to help with patient intake, to take blood pressure, and to listen to stories. I remember my first day there. The clinic manager was a young woman named Sarah, who looked like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. When I handed her my resume, she looked at it for a long time. She looked at my years of experience in the cardiac unit. She looked at my management background. She looked up at me and said, "Evelyn, you are overqualified for this. Why are you here?" I smiled at her. I told her that I was here because I wanted to be. I told her that I had spent enough time managing budgets and staff. Now, I just wanted to manage the comfort of the people walking through the door. For 2 mornings a week, I put on a simple pair of scrubs. I sat at a desk and greeted patients. I held the hands of nervous mothers. I explained medication labels to elderly men who were as stubborn as my husband used to be. And in that clinic, something wonderful happened. Nobody questioned my competence. Nobody asked me if I was feeling okay or if I was confused. Instead, they were grateful. The doctors asked for my opinion on difficult cases because they respected my 3 decades of clinical experience. The patients looked to me for reassurance because I had the calm presence that only comes with age and experience. I was no longer a risk to be mitigated. I was an asset to be valued. I realized that the work that heals you is not always the most demanding work. Sometimes, it is the work that reminds you of what you are still capable of offering. In that clinic, I wasn't a bank account. I wasn't a legacy. I was a nurse. I was a person who knew how to care for others without needing to control them. Grace and I spent our evenings at the local library or browsing through the small independent bookstores in downtown Asheville. We went to a few community meetings. We joined a gardening club. I began to realize that the world was much larger than the few blocks around my old house. I thought about my jade plant often. It sat on the east-facing windowsill in my room. It was thriving. The leaves were a deep, vibrant green. It was putting out new growth, reaching toward the mountain sun. I realized that, like the plant, I was rooting in new soil. My roots were strong, they were healthy, and they were mine. I had been 68 when I left. Now, as the weeks turned into months, I felt younger than I had in years. I had regained my sense of self. I had reclaimed my autonomy. I was living a life that was quiet, purposeful, and entirely on my own terms. My son called me in early December. The conversation was different. It was hesitant. He told me about the weather in our old town. He told me about Megan's kitchen. He didn't ask about my money. He didn't mention Brandon. He sounded like a man who was finally beginning to understand that I was not coming back to the old way of things. I told him I was doing well. I told him about the clinic. I told him about the mountains. I kept the conversation light, but I kept the boundaries firm. I didn't give him my exact address yet. I wasn't ready for a surprise visit. I wanted him to earn my trust back. One honest conversation at a time. I realized that by moving, I hadn't just saved my money. I had saved our relationship. By removing the temptation for him to control me, I had given him the chance to be my son again. It would take time. It would take work. But for the first time since Thomas died, I felt that a future was possible. A future where we were family, but a family built on respect instead of obligation. As I sat on the porch with Grace that evening, watching the stars come out over the mountains, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. I had chosen to begin again, and in that choice, I had found the freedom I didn't even know I was missing. It was a Tuesday afternoon in January when the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. I was sitting in a small coffee shop in Asheville, enjoying a latte and watching the snow fall lightly against the window. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a long text message from Megan. Usually, Megan's messages were short and superficial. But this one was different. It was a confession. She wrote, "Evelyn, I have been carrying this guilt for months, and I need to tell you the truth. I am so sorry for what I did. I was the one who went through your filing cabinet. I was the one who told Caleb we needed to step in." I sat there, the heat of the coffee cup warming my hands, as I read her words. She explained that she and Caleb had found a house they fell in love with in Austin, Texas. It was a beautiful home, much larger than their current one, with a big yard for the kids and a modern kitchen. But they didn't have enough for the down payment, not without selling their current home and having a significant cushion. She confessed that they had started looking at my finances not to steal from me, but to see what they could count on. They wanted to know if I had enough surplus that I could invest in their new home. They had convinced themselves that moving me to a smaller place near them in Austin was the best thing for everyone. They had convinced themselves that by managing my money, they were simply preparing for our collective future. Megan wrote, "We never intended to take your money away. We just started thinking of it as our money too. We thought we were one big family unit, and we didn't realize how much we were hurting your dignity. I crossed a line, and I am so sorry." I put the phone down and looked out at the mountains. I understood that distinction. In their minds, they weren't villains. They weren't the scammers Caleb had warned me about. They were just a young couple with big dreams who had allowed their ambition to cloud their morals. They had begun to view me as a resource instead of a human being. This is a dangerous thing that happens in many families. The children begin to see their parents' hard-earned savings as their own future inheritance. They start making plans for money that does not belong to them. They justify it by calling it care or planning, but at its core, it is a lack of respect. It is the belief that once you reach a certain age, your money is no longer yours to enjoy. It is just a fund waiting to be passed down. I replied to Megan. I told her, "Thank you for the apology." I told her that I appreciated the honesty. I didn't tell her it was okay, because it wasn't. But I told her that I was willing to move forward. I realized that what I had done was right, regardless of their intentions. If I had stayed, if I had let them onto my accounts, their need for that Austin house would have slowly drained my retirement. I would have ended up in a small room in Texas, dependent on their whims, watching my 31 years of hard work disappear into their mortgage. In January, I had my trust documents reviewed by a second attorney in Asheville, just to be absolutely sure. Everything was clean. Everything was protected. Everything was mine. Patricia called me from the old town to confirm that everything was in order. She laughed and asked me how I was enjoying the mountain air. I told her, "Patricia, I am genuinely well, and for the first time in a long time I meant it." A few weeks later, I drove back to my old town for my grandchildren's Christmas recital. I was 3 weeks late because the winter weather had made the drive difficult, but the children didn't care. They were just happy to see their Grandma Evelyn. Caleb and I stood in the school hallway afterward. The air smelled of floor wax and excitement. He looked at me, and I saw his father's eyes in his face. He looked at his shoes and said quietly, "I didn't think you would actually leave, Mom." I told him, "I know you didn't." He said, "I thought you needed us more than you apparently did." I looked at him and said, "Caleb, I did need you. I still do. But I needed you as my son, not as my guardian. I needed your love, not your oversight." He nodded slowly. He had his father's way of accepting a hard truth. He told me that I could come back if I ever wanted to. I told him, "I am happy where I am, Caleb, but I will come visit more. I promise." And I have kept that promise. I am a regular visitor now, but I always stay in a hotel. I always drive my own car. I always maintain my own boundaries. The relationship is being rebuilt, but it is being built on new ground. It is slower. It is more careful. It is a relationship between two adults who respect each other. What I know now, after 68 years, and one very deliberate departure, is this. The instinct to protect the people you love can easily become the instinct to control them. We often mistake the people we love for extensions of ourselves. We think their future is ours to arrange. But I was not my son's future to arrange. I was not a balance sheet to be managed. I was a woman who had earned the right to her own life. I am back in Asheville now. The jade plant is still on the east-facing windowsill. Every morning the mountain light comes through the leaves, and it glows a brilliant, living green. It is still rooting. It is still growing. And so am I. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything. If you are watching this, and you feel the walls closing in, remember this. You have the right to your own life. You have the right to your own choices. It is never too late to change the locks. It is never too late to move toward the mountains. I am Evelyn, and I am finally, truly home. Thank you for listening to my story. Please, take care of yourselves, and take care of your hearts. If this story meant something to you, please like and subscribe to hear more stories of strength and independence. I will see you next time. It was a Tuesday afternoon in January when the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. I was sitting in a small coffee shop in Asheville, enjoying a latte and watching the snow fall lightly against the window. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a long text message from Megan. Usually, Megan's messages were short and superficial. But this one was different. It was a confession. She wrote that she had been carrying this guilt for months, and she needed to tell me the truth. She said, "Evelyn, I am so sorry for what I did. I was the one who went through your filing cabinet. I was the one who told Caleb we needed to step in." She explained that they had found a house they fell in love with in Austin, Texas. It was a beautiful home, much larger than their current one, but they didn't have enough for the down payment. She confessed that they had started looking at my finances, not to steal from me, but to see what they could count on. They had convinced themselves that by managing my money, they were simply preparing for our collective future. She wrote, "We never intended to take your money away. We just started thinking of it as our money, too. We didn't realize how much we were hurting your dignity. I put the phone down and looked out at the mountains. Our money. I understood it then. In their minds, they weren't the villains. They were just a young couple with big dreams who had allowed their ambition to cloud their morals. They had begun to view me as a resource, not as a person. This is a dangerous thing that happens in so many families. The children begin to see their parents' hard-earned savings as their own future inheritance. They justify it by calling it care or planning. But at its core, it is a lack of respect. It is the belief that once you reach a certain age, your money is no longer yours to enjoy. It is just a fund waiting to be passed down. I've since been back to their town for my grandchildren's school recital. Caleb and I stood in the hallway afterward. He looked at his shoes and said quietly, "I didn't think you would actually leave, Mom." I told him, "I know you didn't." He then said, "I thought you needed us more than you apparently did." I looked at him and said, "Caleb, I did need you. I still do. But I needed you as my son, not as my guardian. I needed your love, not your oversight. And so our relationship is being rebuilt. But it is being built on new ground. It is slower. It is more careful. I am a regular visitor now, but I always stay in a hotel. I always drive my own car. I always maintain my own boundaries. I am back in Asheville now. The jade plant is still on the east-facing windowsill. Every morning the mountain light comes through the leaves, and it glows a brilliant, living green. It is still rooting. It is still growing. And so am I. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything. If you are listening to this, and you feel the walls closing in, please remember this. You have the right to your own life. You have the right to your own choices. It is never too late to change the locks. It is never too late to move toward the mountains. I am Evelyn, and I am finally, truly home. Thank you for listening to my story. Please, take care of yourselves and take care of your hearts. If this story meant something to you, please like and subscribe to hear more stories of strength and independence. I will see you next time.